over there at Bloomberg News, joining us from Madrid on again, off again talks. I mean, this morning I read the article on Bloomberg News, Russia and Ukraine restart talks after Kiev hits bombers. I've just finished reading that story. I looked up, there's a red headline going across saying, nope, talks over after an hour. So yeah, I don't know where we're going on that front. All right, let's get down to Washington, D.C. Not that things are any more clear there. Nathan Dean joins us, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst. Nathan, your friends in Congress, they got some work to do here. Let's talk about the tax bill. The House passed something. Now the Senate has it. Where are we on this?
Yeah, so the Senate came back after 1 week, and now we're going to enter what's called the bird bath. I mean, this is actually based off of it's based off of a senator, not the actual bird. But what they're trying to do here is they're trying to figure out what passes via the reconciliation process and what doesn't. So real quickly, under reconciliation, you can essentially only do things that impact the budget. And there's a lot of provisions in any reconciliation package that doesn't. So you have to go to the Senate parliamentarian, somebody who's been in their position, that's not elected, it's just, named. And both the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have to go to that individual and say, does this provision pass what's known as the bird rule? That's called the bird bath. Now, from the investment point of view, I think the most important thing is this Senate Republican strategy of assuming the cost of extending the Trump-era tax cuts, which would be around $3.8 trillion, is effectively zero because it's current policy. If the Senate parliamentarian agrees, then we think we could see a bill that increases the deficit. If the Senate parliamentarian doesn't agree, then all bets are off. And this has to go back to the drawing board in terms of, how are you going to pay for all these, of this bill that's going to cost north of $5 trillion?
Right, and that's what makes the tariff stuff a little bit more confusing, because if you take away some of the tariffs to some extent, then you lose that revenue. So it just makes that a little muddier also.
Absolutely. I mean, the tariffs were never part of the reconciliation process. They're not in the record. They're always like this shiny something in the back of the Republicans' mind saying that, look, we can actually agree to actually increase the deficit because we know the tariffs are back there. But now they're not. And so this idea here is that if you have a bill and the Senate parliamentarian doesn't agree, you have to pay for $5 trillion worth of tax extensions. Economic growth will get you a couple of trillion. And obviously, we're talking about almost $1 trillion worth of cuts to Medicaid, the Inflation Reduction Act, and SNAP benefits. Those are within doubt. But eventually, the Republicans are going to have to agree. Are you going to pass a bill that increases the deficit, or are you going to pass a bill that's going to significantly cut aid or, things like the Inflation Reduction Act to constituencies the Republicans have already said that they don't want to do? Now, we think that this ultimately will go towards a deficit-inducing matter. So for those of you on the bond side or for the fixed income side, this is something when this is passed, probably in the July timeframe, you could see a package that ultimately increases the deficit by several $1 trillion.
Is there any political cost to increasing the deficit?
No, not really, because what I would say is that it's easy to borrow today for pain tomorrow than it is to have a vote where you're going to see that pain fairly soon. When Medicaid work requirements kick in at the end of next year, which is under the House plan, or if you have a bill that's going to gut the Inflation Reduction Act and you're Senator Tom Tillis in North Carolina and you've got re-election next year, if you've got plants being built in North Carolina with jobs, it's going to be very difficult for you to say, I'm going to vote to gut the IRA or I'm going to vote to cut Medicaid when that constituency is going to be harmed very soon. It's much easier to say, we'll borrow today for tomorrow's pain.
What else do you think will be market-moving agenda at this point? So to some extent, it feels like the market's a little more immune to tariffs than they were. Like on an individual sector basis, sure, just take a look at steel stocks today. But as we've learned in the whole taco trade, right, Trump actually chickens out. Is that Trump actually chickens out? Trump eventually always chickens out. I feel like the reaction function to the market as a whole may be changing. If that's the case, what would change that? What would be the big mover?
Well, I would just call out that I think in the tariff front, the semiconductor and the pharmaceutical industry are somewhat exposed at the moment because, the Trump ruling or the court rulings from last week essentially said President Trump can't use IEEPA to move forward with these tariffs. Now, there are other avenues, Section 301, Section 232, and that requires investigations. And we know that there are investigations going on in pharmaceutical and semiconductors. Now, it was always anticipated that these tariffs would be out in May, but the idea of sectoral tariffs somewhat allows, President Trump to continue to implement this. And even though for the idea of the taco trade, sectoral tariffs is something that actually has moved forward. both under the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So I would say that if you're an investor in one of those two sectors, you got to start paying attention, because these investigations are going to conclude at a certain point, and then President Trump will have the authority to say, let's go ahead and implement these tariffs. We'll see what happens.
Hey, Nathan, when do folks down in D.C. start thinking about 2026 election cycle?
Well, I think some of them have already started thinking about it,
Yesterday.
but generally from
they started yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. But what I would say is that once the Republicans pass this one big beautiful bill, call it July, there's really not much else left on the calendar. At the end of the year, in September, we're going to have a government funding fight that could potentially lead to a shutdown. But our general rule of thumb is anything by April of next year, most Congress, all 435 members of the House and 1/3 of the Senate, are essentially saying, look, I'm out this year. I'm going to be paying attention. Because you don't really have serious debates in election years, because remember, for all 435 members of the House, they don't want to be here. Their opponent is out back in their home district campaigning against them. So usually in the election that, say, 9 months before the election, nobody wants to be here in Washington. They want to be out somewhere else. And as a result, things really slow down on the legislative front, and they speed up on the regulatory front.
Oh, man. All right.
It's amazing how our system works at all. You
Right?
think about it. The more I learn about it from Nathan, I'm like, it's amazing stuff anything gets done.
But you can also see, I mean, that's part of what Elon Musk said too, that,
Yep.
I mean, take it with a grain of salt, but he was like, it's just harder to get things done, like a very disillusioned former head of Doge. All right, Nathan, thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. And Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst.